Hi, this is week 9 of environmental ethics, and as you can tell from the course calendar, this will be the last component of our online readings and study questions. After this, we have a little bit of break, and then I will be in Warsaw to work with you in January for 2 weeks. So this will be the last week of new readings and of new questions that you need to contend with, and I want to, again, as usual, do a little bit of introductory work to help us understand what it is we're reading, why it's important, and how to make sense of it. So what I'd like to do with this final week of reading is not so much conclude our discussion of environmental ethics, but rather draw a lot of loose ends to some kind of closure, sort of wrap things around by looking at the question of environmental ethics from a little different vantage point. Environmental ethics as a special field in philosophy really develops out of what's called the analytic tradition, or the Anglo-American tradition. As a result, the majority of people you've been reading have been considered analytic philosophers, for better or worse. The other side, or the other tradition in the sort of philosophical spectrum, is the individuals working in the area of continental philosophy. And those are the folks who come out of the German and French schools, following Heidegger, Derrida, Foucault, etc. Most of my philosophical training as a graduate student is in the continental tradition, but I did a lot of work in my early career out of the analytic tradition. So I really straddle the two traditions, even though in the United States, traditionally, a person is allied with one group or the other group. It's a very strange division that occurs within the field of philosophy, but it's one that we've been living with for almost 100 years, if not longer. So what we're going to do in this 9th week of environmental ethics is look at the question of environmental ethics from a perspective that is perhaps a little surprising. And that is, we're going to look at environmental ethics through the lens of continental philosophy. And that's because there's been a lot of work recently in continental philosophy on animal ethics, on environmental ethics, work that has, up until this point, kind of been marginalized in the continental tradition and almost ignored by those individuals working in the field of environmental ethics out of the analytic tradition. So we have 2 readings. One is from Lucas and Trona, called Ethics and Speaking of Things. The other is Barbara Davy, in Other Face of Ethics in Levinas. And what these 2 readings will do is come at the question of environmental ethics through the lens of 2 really influential continental thinkers, Martin Heidegger on the one hand, and Emmanuel Levinas on the other hand. One being probably the best-known German philosopher of the 20th century, the other being one of the best-known philosophers out of the continental tradition, out of the French tradition, and especially working in the field of ethics. So the Introna piece is going to ask us to really push on Heidegger's thinking to make Heidegger articulate something that his own text doesn't ever talk about. And that is to extract out of his ontology a thinking of things that is able to develop a moral sense of our responsibility for and in the face of things. This is something that Heidegger himself never wrote about. Heidegger himself was not someone who is recognized generally as being an environmental ethicist, but a lot of people recently, and Introna being one of them, has looked at Heidegger as a way of articulating what is now called an object-oriented ontology, or an object-oriented morality. And that is looking at things as having some moral standing, and us having some responsibility to things. You can probably already hear in this way of reconfiguring Heidegger an echo of what we talked about with Floridi. And there's a lot in this rethinking of Heidegger that Introna does that connects up with the work that Floridi does out of the analytic tradition. So as you read and develop your thinking on the Ethics and Speaking of Things article, think about the ways in which Heidegger's ethos of Gelassenheit, as Introna calls it, connects up with and is maybe similar to and perhaps different from what we get in Floridi's information ethics. The other article we're going to read is Barbara Davy and her In Other Face of Ethics in Levinas. If you know anything about Levinas, you know that Levinas is all about ethics in the face of the other. But for Levinas, the other is always configured in a human form. In other words, even though Levinas really challenges a lot of the moral tradition in philosophical thinking, his morality, his philosophy of otherness, or his ethics of otherness, is still anthropocentric in a lot of ways. And Derrida is very critical of this development in Levinas, and for most of their careers, Derrida and Levinas had a huge argument about the sort of anthropocentrism of his own morality and his own way of thinking morality. What Davy will do is try to reconfigure Levinas, to repurpose Levinasian thinking, and ask whether or not animals can have a face and whether or not things can have a face. In other words, asking whether or not we have, again, responsibilities in the face of others that are otherwise than another human individual. And this is a reading of Levinas that Levinas, again, himself probably would not recognize as being his own. But it's taking the Levinasian text and making it do some work that it's designed to do, but somehow restricted from doing by its own author. So the questions this week are going to ask you to grapple with this sort of innovation in thinking through environmental ethics, both from this continental perspective and from the sort of methodology employed by Introna and Davy in order to do this kind of work, because in a sense what they're doing is a kind of violence to the text. They're taking Heidegger's texts and they're taking Levinas's texts and they're trying to make them say and do things they were not designed to do. And there is a moral question in that kind of procedure. And I want us to use their work to understand Heidegger and Levinas as developing an environmental kind of thinking, but also to think about their own effort in reading Heidegger and in reading Levinas, and how what they write about may influence and have an effect on what it is they actually do. So that's all I have for this week. Enjoy the readings, and I will see you in about 3 weeks. Bye.